In this video, we'll look at the player settings available, where we can configure our splash screen, our resolution, and our default icons. To get to your player settings, choose Edit and Project Settings. In addition to finding the player settings in the project settings, we can also access settings for input, for our tags and layers, for audio, for our physics and physics 2D, for quality, graphics, network, editor, and script execution order. These different settings will help us configure not only the Unity editor, but the build of the game, making sure that it's really tuned to the platform. I'll pick Player, and the player settings open in the inspector. In the player settings, you can set the company name and product name, the actual name of your game. I've set mine to Unity Technologies with a product name of Zombie Toys. Next, we'll create a default icon for our game and import it in, just like any other texture. I've opened up Adobe Photoshop, and I've made an image that's 256 pixels square. Then I've put Zombie Toys on it and a dark blue background. Alternately, you might capture a picture from the game or one of the characters as your background. As we can see, this image is 256 pixels square with a resolution of 72 pixels per inch. I've saved this out as a PNG and put it in the UI folder in my assets. I'll go back into Unity and bring in that image as my default icon. Back in Unity, I'll go into the default icon and click on the Select button for your Texture 2D. In the Select Texture 2D dialog, if you've created an image, you can search for it by filtering up at the top. In the Select Texture 2D dialog, you can search for your image by name if you'd like. I'll type in ICO, and there's my Zombie Toys icon, named Icon. I'll select it and close that Select Texture 2D dialog. Now when I publish this project, it'll have that Zombie Toys image as that default icon. If you'd like, you can also configure a default cursor. For now, we're going to leave it blank. In addition to setting the product and company name and default icon and cursor, we can also set our defaults for different platforms. We've got our web player settings, PC, Mac, and Linux standalone, and Android. And again, these will depend on what build platforms you installed as part of installing Unity. I'll work in the settings for PC, Mac, and Linux standalone. Under here, we have our resolution and presentation. By default, default is full screen is checked. This means that the game, when played, will automatically fill the full screen. If you'd like, you can uncheck this and then put in an exact resolution, so it'll play in a window of your determined size. I've added in 1280 by 720 as an example. We can also let the game run in the background, or uncheck that, and simply only run the game when it's a foreground app. The other settings in here then allow us to configure our standalone player options. For example, we have a choice to pull up a display resolution dialog, and this will let our players configure a resolution for the game if they'd like to play in a window. Right now it's enabled. We can have it hidden or disabled. I'll leave it on so we can see that as part of the play. We also can choose in here if our game is supported at different aspect ratios. We may want to limit our aspect ratios if we're aiming for a certain screen size, or if we want our game to have a certain cinematic feel. I'll leave these all checked, although you can always go in and uncheck if you need and build again. Scrolling farther down, open up the icon. And what this does is to take that default icon and populate it to different sizes. If we'd like, we can override for standalone different sizes and bring in different images versus taking the existing one and scaling it either up or down. Lastly, we can choose to make a splash image if we'd like. This is the image that will go in that config dialog as a banner. I'll go back into Photoshop and make a splash image to bring in. I'm here in Adobe Photoshop, and I'm going to make a splash image to go in that config dialog. I'll create a new image by pressing Command-N on a Mac or Control-N on a PC. For the size of this image, we need to put in 432 on the width by 167 on the height. Later, in Unity, we'll mark this as a non-power of 2 texture so it doesn't get compressed oddly. Now I'll bring in an image of the gameplay I've captured. Alternately, you can make up your own graphic for the game, perhaps adding a logo and text. I've opened up the image of my gameplay, and I'll shrink this down and put it in my splash image. I'll press Command-A to select all, Command-X to cut, switch over to the splash image, and paste it in. It looks like this needs to shrink down considerably. I'll drag on a corner of the transform, holding Shift, and scale this down so it fits horizontally across. Next, I'll add some text onto it. Again, my Zombie Toys in my horror font. I'm saving my image out as a PNG in the Assets UI folder. I've named it ZToys Splash so I can find it easily. Now go back in Unity and bring this image in. Back here in Unity, in the UI folder, Unity has already imported in that Splash image, and it's down here in the bottom row. With this image, we need to mark it as a non-power of 2 and change the texture type to Advanced. I'll drop down under Texture Type and choose Advanced, and then change non-power of 2 to None. This will prevent any inadvertent compression because of the odd size. It'll also let Unity regard this as the correct size it is, 432 by 167, instead of trying to scale it to 512 by 128. I'll scroll down and click Apply. And now we can see that this image is the right aspect ratio, that it no longer looks squeezed. We can also see at the bottom of the inspector that it's regarding the size correctly, 432 by 167, sRGB, parenthesis, NPOT, non-power of 2. Now go back to those player settings, choosing Edit, Project Settings, and Player. I'll click on the Select button in that Config dialog banner and go select that image. Again, in the Select Texture 2D dialog, typing in Z, T, and that's enough of a string that I can select my Zombie Toys Splash. If you're working in VR, you can put in a splash image as well, although it's outside of the scope of this course. Note that if you're working in the Personal Edition, you won't have the option to disable the Unity splash screen. Lastly, the Other Settings section in our player settings allows us to configure a rendering path and color space. Both of those are outside of the scope of this courseware. We can also configure the different graphics APIs for Mac. What I've done is to drag OpenGL Core up to the top, deprecating OpenGL 2 down. Once you've got all these settings in, you're ready to look at the quality and finally build your game. Now that we have all the player settings configured, we'll look at our quality settings and then build our game again.